Hey guys, welcome to the final lecture in this section. And in this one we're going to go over customizing Blender with the user preferences that we talked about in the info panel here. So you're going to go to the file menu and then go down to user preferences, and we're going to get in here and start breaking down everything that you see and some things that you can use to make Blender a little easier to use. So the first tab over here is the interface tab. And this houses some miscellaneous commands about what you see when you're interacting with Blender's user interface. But for the sake of this course, we're going to leave all this stuff alone, and we're going to go on to the Edit tab. So the Editing tab has a lot of useful settings related to editing objects. And so this is going to relate to specifically editing things within the 3D viewport here. And if we go through here, it's going to change some of the things that allow you to do things like keyframing, how keyframes are made. You can do them manually. If you turn on automatic keyframing when you're animating, it'll anytime you move something, it'll do it for you. Things like that. Again, some of these things we're not going to go over, but definitely come in here and look at these. One thing I will mention in this one that is going to be useful to you guys starting off is this global undo checkbox. If you uncheck that, it's not going to let you undo anything. So keep that on, but the biggest thing in here is that when you first start Blender, you first install it, it's going to default to 32 steps of undo. And that's fine, but I usually come in here and I crank this up to 64, which is the max. And so if you find yourself the type of person who likes to undo quite a bit instead of going back and just modifying moving forward, then definitely up this to as high as you can get it, and that will be good for you. So that's about it for this menu. Not a lot of things in here that I would need to modify. A lot of this is really specific to different parts of Blender. And again, if you find that you need to turn some of these settings on or play with them, feel free to come in here and do so. You're not going to break anything, but just realize that global undo is the one you're going to use the most. Let's go to the Input tab. So this one, along with the next one for add-ons, are the two tabs that I use probably the most when I am altering the user preferences. So in the Input tab, it's all about the mouse and the keyboard commands. So on the far left, you're going to see things that are more related to mouse stuff, and on the far right, you're going to see stuff that is keyboard commands. So down here, you're going to see this presets drop down. And it's going to default to the Blender presets, obviously, but if you were going to change and come over from other software, such as 3ds Max or Maya, then you could come in here and change these settings, and it would try to automatically update some of the mouse settings and some of the keyboard shortcuts. So it may be useful depending on where you're coming from. But let's get into some of the other options here. If you don't have a 3-button mouse and you're using maybe a trackpad, you can turn this on, and it will allow you to try to emulate that. If you don't have the ability to middle click, this will also allow you to change which key you select with. It defaults to right, as you guys know by now. You right click something in Blender to select it, but if you change that to left, you can left click, and now it'll left click. I'm going to bring that back up. So again, you can change that if you want. I'd leave it the same way because all the tutorials that you take in the future are probably going to teach you how to do things with the defaults, so I would leave that unless you have a good reason for changing it. Emulate numpad is something I would turn on if you don't have those numbers at the far right of your keyboard. It says in the tooltip, you can see they're useful for laptops. And I'm also working on a Mac, and I have one of the newer keyboards that doesn't have that numerical keyboard numpad on the far right. So if I turn this on, I can use the numbers on top of my keyboard to allow me to navigate in the 3D scene. Remember we talked about coming into this view menu and clicking these, which will automatically switch you to these view options? Well, like I said, every single thing in here has keyboard shortcuts. So usually you have to go to numpad 7 here and try to click these on your numpad in order to navigate, but if you turn that option on, now I can navigate with the numbers on top of my keyboard, and it makes things a lot simpler. So back in here once more. Turntable trackball changes the kind of the way that you rotate around something in 3D. So it may be useful. And again, there's just a lot of other things in here that are really specific to how you interact with things in the 3D scene. So that's all your mouse settings. Over here, your keyboard settings, which again, you're going to find really useful because you can change the way things are done. So perfect example is because of the way the keyboard is set up, again, without that numerical numpad on the far right, there's a keyboard shortcut I always used to use, which is center viewport, which is in the 3D view, and it's let's see, let's go in here and look for it real fast. Tell you what, another way to do this is if you're trying to find something and you can't, you can switch this from name to key binding, and you can actually just type in the keyboard shortcut and it'll tell you where it's supposed to be. Now, what I'm looking for is the keyboard shortcut, which normally sets the viewport to recenter itself to be focused around an object. So we went over earlier on, we went over Shift C. So we talked about getting like way off in the corner. Hitting Shift C will take you back to the middle. Well, you can also change what your scene is going to be orbiting around and focused around based on this keyboard shortcut, which is View Selected. So normally you would right click in here and you would go to View and then select it here, View Selected. What that will do is you can see the numpad period is the keyboard shortcut for that. It will alter your center of view around whatever object you are selecting. So if you're coming from Maya, I know that some of you may be coming from other software. F is the command in Maya for focus on an object. It does the exact same thing. Go to View, View Selected. There we go. Now we're back to the center. And so I can't use this because I'm with a keyboard that doesn't have that option. Because I can't just use the period, I have to use the numpad period because that's the way it's set up. So what I do is I come over here and I go to that command, View Selected, and you can see here it's Control Numpad or Numpad period. But I've also added a keyboard shortcut with this /, which will allow me to use that instead on my keyboard when I want to focus on something. So if I come back in here and I hit my / key, now it'll do the same thing. And you can see that's really handy because, again, depending on your keyboard layout, or especially people that have keyboards that are not the normal layout that we use, whatever that reason that is, whether it's a custom gaming keyboard or maybe a keyboard from a different country, it may be laid out a little differently. So you may need to come in here and alter these keyboard settings, which is fine. And again, you can also change a bunch of stuff in here and then hit this plus icon and save a preset. So it's going to keep that the way it is every time you load Blender, and you're not going to have to do this over and over again, which is, of course, really handy. So let's move on to the add-ons menu. This menu is kind of like Blender's extendability with plugins. So if you come in here and you're familiar with the idea of plugins, this is where they're at in Blender. So Blender by default comes with a bunch of stuff that's already loaded and that you can use in your scenes, but there's a lot of extendability options that they put in that's built into the software from other people that have made these plugins, but they're not turned on. So you have to come in here and turn them on manually if you want to use them. And the reason for that is because they want to keep Blender, when you first install it, as lightweight and as fast as possible. Because when you start rendering things, it's really going to slow down if you have everything in here turned on. So I'm going to go over a couple of things that I use quite a bit. We talked about the global search menu that you can use inside Blender. So if I'm down here and I'm going around and I forget a command, remember you can hit spacebar and it'll bring up that search menu. Well, another thing that I do a lot is I use one of these plugins for the dynamic spacebar menu. And what that does is it alters what the spacebar does, and instead of that global search menu, turns on a different menu. So let me show you what that does. If I turn that on just by checking that box and hit spacebar now, it's going to turn on the dynamic spacebar menu. And I can still click here and go back to that search, but if I hit spacebar and instead go through these, I've got access to all the menus I would normally use for almost every single thing in Blender right at the spacebar. So again, really handy. You can, again, always go back to this and search for something. But if you want to add an object, instead of hitting Shift A like we talked about, you can just hit spacebar now, and you can add objects, move them around, add modifiers, parent things, create custom selections. They've even got shortcuts in here for turning your tool shelf on and off, entering and exiting edit mode, deleting stuff, things like that. So really handy, and I use that quite a bit. One of the other things I'll talk about is extra objects plugin. If you go down to right below this, landscape we just turned on, extra objects. If you turn this one on, you go right back into that mesh menu, and if you hit spacebar and go to add mesh, it's going to add these extra objects such as gemstones, gears, things like that. Or you can go find there's all sorts of stuff in here. Honeycomb, which is kind of cool. One of the other things you guys might find useful, if you come down here, come into the gears thing, they got a worm gear. So again, a good way to start building a really complicated object. And again, this is a plugin that they've built this gear from, so it's not just an object that someone's created and then saved and they're importing it. They're actually creating this from math on the fly. So you can come in here as soon as you create it, alter the number of teeth, number of rows, make it bigger or smaller, radius, bigger fat, things like that. And so you can see just by changing these settings over here, and I'm just left clicking and I'm dragging, it's going to allow me to kind of alter what's going on. So there you go, kind of an interesting thing. And again, there's a lot of things that I probably don't know about that are in here that you could turn on that will add a lot of interesting things. I know pipe joints does the same sort of thing, so if you want to turn that on, do that. And let's see, one last thing I'll go over is that if you scroll down to the very bottom, you're going to see some things that are already turned on. But if you look at these import export options, if you get into pulling in models that are models you haven't created, but perhaps that you've bought from somewhere or that you've downloaded for free, you can come into the import export options, and you're going to find a lot of things that aren't turned on by default. But you may find a model format in here that you download, and if you can't find it in the file import or export menu by default, if you come into the add-on section and user preferences, you don't have to look through this whole menu, by the way. You can just come over here and go to import export, and it'll take out everything that's not related. But anyways, there's a lot of things that are turned off. So perfect example being light wave objects, turn those on, you can import those. Milk shape, nuke objects, DirectX. So if you're in games, you might find this really useful because there's a lot of objects in here that are related to those. Unity objects especially, you can import those here. So pretty useful. And I think that's going to kind of wrap us for the add-ons menu. So let's get into the themes menu. Themes menu is basically going to let you customize all the colors for buttons, text, panels, and windows in Blender. It's really powerful, but it's also kind of dangerous. So if you come in here and you start modifying the default Blender colors, then you want to be really careful with what you do, because I would come in here first and create a new preset, name it, and then hit OK before you start tweaking things. That way you can always go back to one of the default settings and you'll be here. But bear in mind, like, in every panel that you see in Blender is listed here, so this is all your 3D viewport stuff, and as you can see, everything is available for you to tweak. So if you don't like the size of something, the color it uses, you don't like the fact that all this stuff is gray, you want to change this to black or whatever you want to do, there's a lot of themes that are available for download, but you can also come in here and look at these default themes to check those out and tweak those. So useful for some of you. File menu is going to get you up and running with setting the default settings for all of your system paths. So what that's going to do is a lot of the plugins and things in Blender are going to need to find things like fonts on your system, or they're going to look in at a default directory for what program to use to edit pictures, like Photoshop for image editor, things like that. And so it's important to come in here and kind of set these up to where those programs are located. That way, if you go to a plugin and you just click the button, edit image, then it's going to know exactly where to look for Photoshop. Otherwise, you'll have to tell it specifically at that point where to go. Temp is the directory that it's always going to render to by default if you don't tell it where to go. Okay, so we got our cube. Now if you just hit animation and you don't tell it where to go down here in the output section, it's going to go straight to your temp directory. And the reason it goes to the temp directory is the same reason that this directory is set up here for temp. They're the same thing. So your temp directory is always going to be where it goes when you don't tell it where to go. And so if you want to go somewhere else besides where Blender is installed and you want to have an external hard drive to put those things on, check this out, change that to something more useful, and it'll definitely help out. But also be aware, if you're going to do saving a bunch of images or a big large movie for an animation somewhere, definitely go to this output menu and tell it where to save it. Okay, let's get back to the user preferences. So there's some other things in here you can see, be aware of, such as how often to save revisions of files. It'll tell you whether or not to autosave things, how many minutes in between saves to take before it autosaves. So some pretty helpful settings there, and you may want to tweak those. And the last menu we're going to go over is the system menu. Now, the system menu allows you to alter settings related to your system performance as it relates to Blender. So you're going to want to think about sound card and graphics card settings. Pretty much is this whole menu. So if you come in here, it's gonna allow you to choose what kind of sound engine you can use. I don't really change this because, again, I don't really use sound that much in Blender. I don't usually edit with it. You can change your screencast settings if you're going to record video of you doing something in Blender. Whether or not you use your CPU or your graphics card to render specific things, which won't come in until you start really getting into other rendering engines other than the Blender default engine. But you can also, come in here and change the kind of sampling you're using for textures and things like that. So if you've got a better graphics card and you know that you can up these settings, come in here and turn things up, and you'll see a performance boost in the 3D viewport. Otherwise, I usually don't touch these. I leave these at the defaults, and they're fine the way they are. So again, use caution coming in here and altering these settings. But if you want to get in here and play around, you can. And again, you will see a performance boost if you change these settings, and your system can handle it. So be aware of that. And that's going to wrap us for the user preferences, guys. There's a lot of stuff to learn here, so I would definitely recommend watching this again if you need to come in here and figure out how to do specific things. Bear in mind that if you're going to get involved in editing custom preferences, the only thing you really need to do is probably edit the input and the add-on menu, and you'll have enough there to tweak Blender quite a bit. So that's handy. And that's going to be it. So in the next section, I'll explain how you can start building your own objects as we tackle modeling in Blender. And I'll see you there.